The US and Ukraine have signed a 10-year bilateral security agreement on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Italy. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said the pact would protect not just his country, but the world from Russian aggression. G7 leaders also backed a multi-billion-dollar deal to use frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine strengthen its defenses and pay for reconstruction.
Leaders of the world's 7 advanced democracies and the European Union sorted out an emergency parachute for Ukraine on day 1 of the G7 leaders' summit in Italy. They agreed to use the interest generated by Russia's central bank funds that have been frozen in European banks to create a $50 billion loan facility for Ukraine.
We're not talking about the confiscation of these assets, but the interest that accrues over time.
Our finance ministers are now working out the mechanisms. It is a clear sign to the Russian president. He cannot simply sit this matter out and hope that he will be able to win this war because of fiscal problems in some countries that are currently supporting Ukraine. He won't.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy was invited to attend the 3-day summit. He signed a 10-year security agreement with the United States, which includes greater intelligence sharing, military training and weapons manufacturing.
Our goal is to strengthen Ukraine's credible defense and deterrence capabilities for the long term. A lasting peace for Ukraine must be underwritten by Ukraine's own ability to defend itself now and to deter future aggression anytime in the future.
Zelenskyy calls the agreement historic and hopes it will secure Ukraine's place in NATO.
The issue of NATO is covered through the text of the agreement. It states that America supports Ukraine's future membership in NATO and recognizes that our security agreement is a bridge to Ukraine's membership in NATO.
The G7 leaders are standing firm against Russia now, but it's not clear how united they will be if NATO's biggest backer, the US, gets a new president, one who is not so willing to support Ukraine.
William Courtney from the think tank RAND explained what impact the agreement is likely to have for Ukraine.
Well, it is a historic agreement. It's not just the U.S. agreement. A number of European countries have also signed similar agreements. The main purpose is to send a political signal to Russia that Europe and the United States, the West, are fully behind Ukraine as it defends itself against Russian aggression, but also to provide a greater degree of certainty over the long term for the kind of assistance, military assistance especially, that Ukraine will receive from the West.
Well, Biden stressed that this security agreement is meant for the long run, as you mentioned. But if Donald Trump is re-elected president in November, could that jeopardize the agreement?
Yes, and in fact, all of the countries are democracies, and so no government today can make a pledge for all future governments, and whether it's the U.S. or a European country. If President Trump is the next president, that could have some impact, no question. But by putting in place agreements like this, building a stronger political consensus in the alliance, as well as in the countries that make up the alliance, this makes it a little harder for governments in the future to turn away.
Now, many G7 leaders are facing problems at home. We're speaking of dwindling support from their voters, inflation, migration, tensions linked to the Middle East crisis. How much weight does this group still have on the international stage?
Well, G7 is still the organization that so many countries around the world look up to as the organization that does an awful lot to preserve what people call the international rules-based order, the fair, equal treatment of countries around the world in so many economic and other areas. So, for example, so many world leaders which are not members of G7 have come to the G7 meeting. That's a sign of how important these countries regard the G7.
That's William Courtney from think tank RAND. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're quite welcome.
Well, Jakob Kirkegaard is with the German Marshall Fund think tank in Brussels. His work focuses on trade and economics. He's also worked for the Danish Ministry of Defence and for the UN in Iraq. Welcome to DW. Let's start with the basics. Is this G7 plan even legal? Can you just freeze billions of dollars of a country's assets and then do whatever you like with the interest on it?
Well, I mean, I don't know if I would go as far as to say it's unprecedented, but I certainly consider it legal, given that Russia is engaged in an illegal war of aggression against a neighboring country. And these assets are already seized within Western financial institutions.
And this would be a loan. So how would that work? Who would Ukraine pay it back to, and who takes the hit if a Ukraine crippled by war can't pay it back?
Well, the loan will be seemingly issued by a syndicate of different lenders, presumably a mixture of public and private banks from around the G7. And if, you know, I mean, this loan is obviously predicated on Ukraine ultimately winning the war. And then as part of a long-term peace settlement, winning reparations from Russia, from which the repayment of the loan would come. Obviously, in the event that Ukraine does not win the war, then the holders or the issuers of those loans would have to I mean, Ukraine would not be able to repay it, and you know, the G7 would be stuck with the bill. So the good news here is that by agreeing to this loan, the G7 is very much putting their own money on the line to secure a Ukrainian victory.
And doesn't a move like this open up the US and Europe particularly to reprisals? What's to stop Russia doing exactly the same, seizing European property and other assets?
Well, I think that's very likely that this might happen. But I would also say that those particularly European companies that are still operating in Russia will do so knowing that this risk of arbitrary nationalization by the Russian government was always there. Hopefully, such companies will already have written down the asset value of their Russian operations to zero. That certainly, in my opinion, would be the prudent thing to have done. Or they will have taken out appropriate sovereign risk insurance against these types of nationalizations. So the bottom line is that, yes, I think we should expect Russian reprisals against European, particularly firms in Russia. But these countries are not a group of companies that I can feel sorry for. They knew the risk.
So this loan is said to be something like $50 billion. How far will that go?
Well, I mean, it's important to understand that this is $50 billion on top of earlier commitments by, for instance, the European Union, which has pledged 50 billion euros until 2027. There is still an ongoing IMF program that also provides funds for the Ukrainian government. And of course, the US Congress recently appropriated a sizable amount of money as well. So this money, I mean, the whole pot of money, therefore, in my opinion, certainly for the short to medium term, and by that I mean the next 18 months or so at a minimum, should provide Ukraine the financial capacity to continue to resist Russian aggression.
And so what will it be used for, this particular $50 billion pot? What's that been earmarked for?
Well, it's a little unclear yet, except that the G7, the sort of readouts from the G7 statement that is likely to be published tomorrow indicates that different parts of the loan will be earmarked for, you know, reconstruction, some of it for outright military purchases, and some of it for, if you like, broad-based budget support for all the different expenses of the Ukrainian government, wages and other things. So it's really likely to be a mixture that obviously also reflects the most urgent need of the Ukrainian government when this loan becomes available at the end of the year. It may be at that time that military purchases are more important than reconstruction, or perhaps vice versa. We don't know yet.
And why stop at the interest on these seized Russian assets? Why not use the actual $300 billion or so in Russian assets that the EU and G7 have seized?
Well, if you do that, I think there might be concerns about the legality of such a move. And there's certainly in some European capitals, noticeably Germany, but also former colonial powers, France and Italy, will be concerns about legal precedent. Because these are obviously countries that have a history, both during World War II and earlier during the colonial era, from which there may be entities around the world that wish to sue them. So therefore, there has clearly been resistance among European governments to go to the outright seizure of the underlying assets. There's also this issue that the EU knows that they are going to be providing the majority of the funds for reconstructing Ukraine after the end of the war. And therefore, if you were to seize the underlying assets today to provide weapons, you might be cannibalizing, so to speak, the pot of money that would be available to pay for reconstruction after the war.
Thanks for talking us through that so clearly. Jakob Kirkegaard from the German Marshall Fund.